Welcome to Knowledge Unbound. This is episode 10. I'm kind of sad, man. I'm not sad. I'm happy that we got to 10 episodes. I'm happy that you stay with us for this journey. Knowledge Unbound is brought to you by the Rios Institute for Racially Just, Inclusive, Open STEM Education. We are generously funded by the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. My producer, the forever Mr. Segev Amasai, computer engineering major, class of 2025. Thanks for being with me on this journey, and I really hope listeners enjoyed every single episode, every single conversation that we've had so far. I can't think of a more appropriate way to end our first season by the discussion we're about to have. Dr. Imad is an associate professor at Connecticut College in New London, Connecticut. We've been friends for several years, and trust me when I tell you, the 1 hour we spent together today can't do justice to the complexity and the depth of how she thinks. So to that extent, I just hope that what we share today just provides a window into the way she writes, the way she sees the world, and the way she tries to help people think about unique ways of transformation. And I'll just leave it there. I hope you enjoy the conversation. So Maze, welcome to Knowledge Unbound.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you for that heartfelt introduction.
People have to know that you actually heard the introduction, right? That's how you know it's hard. Well, because a lot of the episodes, I tend to record the intro and outro separate. So,
I see.
So you actually got to witness.
Yeah.
But I do mean every word I say.
Thank you.
Where to start with you, man? Where to start? Because I want you to do an introduction, and maybe that's where to start. Right? I want you to do an introduction, but I think your journey is so unique. We could pick one part of it and spend the whole hour, right? But maybe let's just start. If somebody walked up to you in the street and said, "You look interesting. What do you do?" What would you tell them?
Yeah. Wow. I don't know where I would start.
You might run, right?
Yeah. Well, I am, if we're going to get philosophical, I probably would say I am in the business of, I'm trying to remember what it means to be whole. And to do so, I can't do that alone. And so I've been blessed to be able to do that with others, students and colleagues such as yourself. Because I come to this work in a way very heartbroken. As you know, and maybe some of our listeners know, that I have been interested not just from an academic, but just from a human perspective in trauma and what trauma does to us, to our humanity, and it shatters assumptions we have about ourselves and the world. And in the classroom is where I began to see possibilities for healing. Yeah, so I would say
Did you see it as when you were a student in the classroom, or when you were an instructor, in whatever capacity?
Yeah, I saw it. No, I loved being a student, and also struggled being a student, because now I see that the system is still very much separates us from knowledge, separate us from the world, separate us from each other. But I was excited about being a student because I wanted to learn. I wanted to know. I wanted to create and co-create. It was as an instructor when I began to see those possibilities for healing.
Right. So let me dig into that statement, wanting to be whole, because I imagine, tell me if I'm wrong about this, I imagine that when you were a first-year student at University of Michigan Dearborn, am I correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. You didn't go to your dorm and say, or wherever you lived, and said, I'm trying to make myself whole. Right?
Correct.
And even in my own following of your writings and of your work, right? over time you're able to give language to something that's in you.
Yeah.
I'm curious as to when were you able to find that language, and was there anything that gave you the freedom or the avenue to to ascribe that vernacular to what you were feeling?
Yeah, so that's a really important question because oftentimes when we are fragmented, we don't have the language. We don't have the language to then help us even ask the question of how we might put the pieces back together.
Right.
And in fact, Adrian Rich talks about, in those situations, describing the classroom, it feels like a psychic disequilibrium. So I didn't have the language. What I did have is the language of what's wrong with me. Yes, what's wrong with me and it was really in the classroom with my students and this mirroring and bearing witness where I began to see that that I had to do better. And I don't mean do better by doing more active learning or, but to do better by the humanity of the people that I was working with in my own humanity. It would take years later before I could say,
Yeah, that's what you were really doing.
Yeah.
What was when you were undergraduate? What was your major?
I majored in philosophy.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, I majored in philosophy. I loved to pontificate. I loved, I thought science was boring. And right? Isn't that, I want my students, but I just thought I wanted to discover. I mean, I didn't have that language, but I wanted to, and I wanted, I think the first time I did take science classes. I minored in chemistry, and I had Professor Mark DeCamp, an organic chemistry professor that I ended up doing research with, and we were discovering synthesizing new compounds. And the idea of going where there was no answer was just so fascinating, and it was so much easier in philosophy. But when I began to see that, no, this is what science is about, then I thought, all right, let me give science a chance.
So let's talk a little bit about the pieces that you're trying to make whole. Take us to young Mays. I believe you grew up in Baghdad.
Yeah, I grew up in Baghdad, in Iraq.
Tell us about that journey and to the extent you're comfortable, what happened along the way that then put you in a state where you needed to recover something?
Yeah. So I grew up in Baghdad. Baghdad is beautiful. I hope one day I could take you there. And people are, there's a lot of satire and this ability to, they endure and endure and endure, and they do that with anger and humor and self-deprecation. And it's a very, there's melancholy and there's melody, in that culture, and a community and chaos, a beautiful chaos. So I grew up in a family that very much education was central. And we also grew up during a time of dictatorship, and education was central. My parents were, always it was not even an option, So, and in education, this losing myself in knowledge and then also finding myself in knowledge. So it was, I loved language and experiments and math. And it was, again, going to places of unknown. And it was also a country where there were lots of wars, the Iraq-Iran war. And the Iraq-Iran war, we didn't feel a lot. I mean, it was a war. We had, my beloved uncle was a prisoner of war. So it affected our family, affected every family. And then the Desert Storm, that war was really, I would say this is when the rupture began. The rupture in some assumptions I held about humanity. And there is a particular incident that I just recently began to talk about it, because for a long time I tried to understand it from linearly. Why would I? But it was during the war, and it was during the bombing, and bombs were falling on us, windows shattered, and my father had.
Did you have to go to bomb? I'm assuming.
Yeah, we actually, the one night we were instructed to go to bomb shelters, that night my grandfather said no one goes. I mean, he had his own way, and he said we die alone. We die together, in fact. And because in the bomb shelter they're going to separate the men from the women and children. And my grandfather said, no, we die in our home and we die together. And we didn't. And the shelter we were going to go to, Al-Amriya shelter, ended up being bombed that night. And I lost classmates. And so there was that. There was that bombing that was that one night.
So you were supposed to be there.
We were supposed to be there. Yes. Al-Amriya, was devastating. So there was that. But that one night where the bombs were falling, windows were shattered, this is it. This is the night. We're going to go. I remember whispering to myself, why would they do this to us? Right? And I was like a middle school child, didn't really understand, but somehow, so over the years, I would say, why would I ask myself this question? I didn't know any Americans. Why would I say, why would they do this to us? But over the years, I learned that my innocent, naive, had like some basic understanding in humanity and connection, that didn't matter where Americans were, that we were their fellow human beings, and how could they do this to us?
But it almost I know you. I'm gonna let you continue, but I'm sticking on the they.
Yeah.
Right? It's one word, but it encompasses a whole lot of people as a monolith, which I know you didn't intend.
Yeah.
But it almost feels as though as the years went by, it was your attempt to kind of unpack that monolith. It's like, well, who's the they? The they are humans. That I think we can agree on as a monolith in and of itself. But sort of beyond that, right? Not everybody's making the decision to
right.
come. Not everybody is doing the act of dropping a bomb. Not everyone's agreeing or disagreeing. And so trying to figure out where everyone is in that weird mosaic.
Yes.
Is a challenge, right?
It's a challenge. And when you are, again, a child and you ask that question, my mind then created that narrative in us, the victims, and we were, and then them, everybody else. And even though I was talking about Americans, it was complicated. Where was the world? Why was the world silent? And so that was the beginning of the rupture. And then, of course, the rupture of being a refugee and being stripped from your homeland, and then ironically coming to the country that made you a refugee.
And what year did you come?
I came in 1993 with my parents. And so in throughout all of this, I always fell back on education. That education was going to be the answer. Education is going to heal me. Education is going to... I buried myself in education. And then I would come to the United States, and education here was very different. Very different, very separate. There is this subject, and this subject does nothing with this subject, and then the separation of the teacher and the student.
What was it like in Baghdad?
It was more, I would say it was more holistic. So I remember like my chemistry teacher, like just dropping poetry in the classroom, and my Arabic teacher, and I've written about her, my composition, she would like say things and make jokes about science. And so there was more. And of course, I'm 45 right now. So there is this tendency to probably romanticize some of that childhood of mine. Yeah. Yeah.
So I feel like the recognition of the education structure was different was probably more or less immediate,
Yeah.
right? Once you were a student, um, then so you go through Dearborn, and apparently you like the science classes because you then decided to do a
Yeah.
doctorate, right? I guess I can look at philosophy and chemistry and say it makes sense to me, but I feel there's more that went into that decision than just, well, these things might lead to neuroscience, topically
Yeah.
speaking.
So I took philosophy of science, I took philosophy of consciousness, and it was in my philosophy of consciousness where I began to see I wanted more of what is going on in the brain. So I remember like looking in the course catalog to see, who I could speak to. And there was a professor, Richard Norman, in the biology department who taught neurobiology. And I sent him an email, I believe. And I said, can I meet with you? Can you teach me about the brain? And it was he wrote back. It was a beautiful meeting. We started talking about, he started teaching me about the brain. And he said, why don't we read a book together? And we read a book, The Feeling of What Happens by Antonio Damasio. Just a really, Antonio Damasio has, in a way, guided my work years later because of that incident. And so the more I worked with Richard Norman, I ended up taking a course with him, the more I thought, I want to learn more about the brain at like the most basic levels, and then go back to philosophy. It didn't work out that way. I
think it
Yeah.
kind of did, because
Yes.
you sort of philosophize now in the way you write and the way you think about things.
Yeah. So
Yeah. So let's fast forward a little bit, because one of the things I think most people know about your work is how you think about trauma, how you well, I guess first acknowledge that it exists, not just in cases like yourself, but also in the students that we teach. Not everybody like you is a refugee or has trauma in that specific way, but it exists in some kind of spectrum. From a teaching and learning perspective, how would you summarize what you've seen, what you think our responsibilities are to students, and then I'll leave the biggie for last. What kind of system we need to set up so that how people's mental health and people's the mental environment is taken care of so they can be their best selves.
yeah. So it is clear from national and international data that the young people are not all right. And I would say, we are not all right. Because of the climate change, because of the political divisiveness, because of the poverty, because of we are social creatures and we depend on others and connections and meaning for our survivability. And so the data is very solid. It was solid before the pandemic. In light of the pandemic, and we are in the business of teaching and learning as we know, you're a biologist, is a biological process. Learning, forming synapses, strengthening synapses. And so part of it is I began to see that how much of my teaching practices are not following the science of learning. In the cramming, in the content, in the relationships, all of that. So I think if we want to, as we claim, to improve students' learning and their success and their thriving, then we have to pay attention to the factors that are impacting those things. And this includes psychological factors, trauma, intergenerational trauma, and so on. So I began to really was working with students where I began to I was afraid to ask the question as boldly as I'm going to right now, but it was in the back of my mind. What harm am I causing through my teaching? And when, for example, when students will say, it must be me, I'm just dumb, I'm this, all this self-deficit, and I was recognizing that I'm contributing to this, it really became increasingly difficult for me to just perpetuate a system I grew up in. Yes, I survived it, but I thought there has to be another way. There has to be another way, and I would come across Bell Hooks's "The classroom remains the most radical space of possibility." And I was like, what the heck does that mean? Right? Like, which classroom? But it was almost like it was in my face, in my heart. And it was like, how do I make that possible? Possibilities for healing, possibilities for growth. And it really, it was like beckoning me to, that line from her teaching to transgress, to like go deeper, go deeper. Yeah. Yeah.
So tell me a bit more about that, because I feel like somebody listening, right? And I definitely don't want to get you into the like do these 5 things and everything will be okay kind of language, but somebody may agree with you, and then ask themselves the question: okay, well, what then does it mean to acknowledge that a trauma exists, right? Because I can listen through this podcast, I can listen to May's talk and say, oh yeah, I now agree that trauma exists. Okay, now what's my next step?
Yeah.
Right? If I'm an instructor of intro physics.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't want to decouple that from the bigger message that you're trying to communicate. But I also perhaps want people to feel like they have a little bit of power to take a next step.
Yeah, they definitely.
So even if you have to pick one or two,
I mean, they definitely have power. We all have power. And I think when you look at the trauma theories and the literature and healing and all of that, it is we're not trying to get rid of trauma. We're trying to acknowledge it and then foster a space where people feel empowered and safe and connected. Any instructor can do that. A physics instructor, a philosophy instructor, an art history instructor. And so I think it begins with this intention that we can do better and I want to do better. And then taking baby steps. What does this mean?
What does better look like?
What does better look like?
Yeah.
So for instance, you know that I have been kind of playing with and dancing with the notion of sanctuary. And while I continue to kind of imagine and reimagine, whenever I I reach a place where I think, well, a sanctuary should have an element of X, then I ask myself, what can I do to provide that element for my students?
Right. Okay.
So for instance, right now, speaking of sanctuary, in the Semitic languages, including Arabic, you could trace every letter to every word to a 3-letter verb. And the word for sanctuary, you trace it back to forbid, right? So the word for sanctuary is very closely to the word for the sacred mosque. And you look deeper and what does a sanctuary have to do with to forbid or to prohibit? It is to prohibit harming others and yourself. And so then the more I think about it, I go back to what kind of harm am I doing with my teaching? And what is the opposite of that? It's not just do no harm.
Right. right?
It's not
Well, and I
just
guess that's
that.
where the empowerment comes from, right?
Yeah.
So and this is maybe back to the whole like acknowledgement point. I my take on how you restated that, right? So you acknowledge it, yes, but what I'm getting from the sanctuary analogy, all right, this is Maze's journey and how you've unpacked what do no harm means in terms of okay, what do I do? What good do I do? But maybe the challenge to the instructor is, well, once you've done the acknowledgement, can you define a vision for what your classroom can look like, right? What is it? What is, as Bell Hooks' radical challenge? How does that unfold in your intro physics class? Like if you had to take all the archaic structures out, like it's 3 credits, it's 15 weeks, there's requirements. I don't want to poo-poo everything, but if deep down there's more that this experience can be and you can go deeper, are you brave to envision what that is like and then sort of work towards it in the same way you Maze are working towards the sanctuary?
Yeah.
I know it's hard, right?
It's very hard.
But it's
and I think it requires that we do our own work. So one of the things that I say, and this every faculty could do it, whether you have the resources, you don't have the. I think let's not assume that our students know we care about them. We tell them, we spell it out, we repeat it, because it's very easy when we are under the influence of strong negative emotions and we feel cynical and to say, well, why does he care about me? Why should he care about me? So I think, but it requires work, because there are days when we instructors, educators, we wake up and we don't feel connection to our own self. As how am I going to show up?
And we are also not in a system that allows us to acknowledge that sometimes.
Right. How am I going to show up and tell people you matter, you're brilliant, And so it really takes, I think more than ever, it takes developing some kind of personal practice to help us reground, reconnect, Yeah.
Well, it makes me think back to your point about instructing a classroom, and you use yourself as the example of you felt you were doing harm, right? And where I want to slightly push back on that just a little bit is I worry that this system sets us up into this false dichotomy where, okay, we progressive enough to know that it's not the student. You don't put the blame on the students, right? And I acknowledge as an instructor, I am going to shoulder a lot of responsibility for what happens. But also, the system needs to have an environment that allows the instructors to be their best selves, right? And so in order for instructor A to do no harm and to then go beyond that and really get towards that sanctuary level, right? What are the things the system needs to do to allow them to do that interrogation, that digging, that journey, that bravery we're asking of them?
Yeah.
The message that's communicated to them is that it's just up to you to figure it out. If we don't couple that with, and here's the ways we are going to support you to go on that journey.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. I mean, I'm thinking of an adjunct faculty who teaches chemistry, and they have to follow a curriculum. And even though they know that, giving a 60 multiple choice exam question that's high stake, that is the AC, American Chemical Society, ACS, is not the best way to assess. They have to, right? And so I recognize that I have certain privilege when I say, it's up to the instructor. Because sometimes the instructors themselves don't have that support. So in that sense, then what I say is, we really, those of us in positions where we could advocate, we have to agitate the system. And what this means is I'm not an adjunct faculty at the moment. It's important. It's a moral imperative that any chance I have, any platform I have, that I say, how are we going to support our adjunct faculty? How are we going to empower them to have more autonomy? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that could be its own rabbit hole.
Right.
I mean, you really cracked the door. But I'll sidestep it for a second. I will come back to it. But I wanna talk a little bit I want you to help me with something here. Let's talk about COVID for a second, right? For most people, maybe not, probably everybody, right? You've never lived through something like this,
Right.
right? Especially if you were born and raised in the U.S. or the West, you know. And even when I think back to COVID, like the real height of it, no vaccines yet, not really sure what's going to happen, how scared you need to be, and then as things, I dare say, improved a little bit with vaccines and better procedures, a better understanding of what you're dealing with. I was actually kind of heartened to see a lot of articles come out where people seem to start to understand this very toxic relationship we have with work in the U.S. context in particular. There's the glorification of burnout, the elevation of busyness and working through weekend and making family sacrifices. I mean, and I don't want to go the next extreme and say none of this has to happen. I understand productivity is a thing, but the balance was off for a long time,
Yes.
right? And maybe it's because people were stuck at home. It started to feel, I'm saying this unscientifically, but it started to feel like people were finally starting to see that imbalance for what it was, and making some brave decisions like leaving work, quiet quitting, whatever you call it, being willing to have a less household income in order for your mental health to be in a better place. And just specific to higher ed, I actually had a little bit of hope that we had an opportunity to finally recognize and see a different way to care and love for students and each other and our jobs, see that humanistic side of our craft. And I've been disappointed in perhaps the way I've seen the pendulum swing gone back. Not everybody, right? Not everybody. And it would be remiss of me to not point that out, right? But I guess what I'm asking you, as somebody who's more steeped in this work than I am, why don't you think there was more learning? There wasn't more learning from that. And is there a challenge then to people like yourself and myself and those of us who, practice the way we practice, to make this argument either more forcefully or more clearly or in a different way?
Yeah.
I know I'll give you a lot, but...
Right. So as you know, these things are learned behavior. Work addiction, perfectionism, those are all learned behavior. And we had moments of awakening, like, I can't do this. I don't want to do this. And unlearning is not easy. It takes time, persistence, community. And so just when we started unlearning and saying, no, I really, there has to be another way, then came that push to go back to normal, get the numbers back, students, enrollment, revenue, all of these things. And we fall back on the routines that we were used to, even when we know it was not healthy, is not healthy, So, of course, it's very frustrating. It's very frustrating because here we are, and many people were saying, like, okay, the silver lining of the pandemic is that we see that we can't sustain it. We can't, expect this of students or ourselves. And it's frustrating to see that we're going back. We're going back to, people are going back to the tyranny of content, the high-stake exams, the, publish or perish. It is. So it's going to require, that we have some kind of community to help, this group of faculty that say, no, there's got to be another way to support each other. And to continue, I think, to agitate. I really don't think, and this is not coming from a pessimist, but I think we've neglected the humanity of the system for so long that having these, 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 workshops is not just going to magically transform it. I think what we could do is start to agitate and plant seeds so the next generation and the following generation can maybe see the fruit. Yeah.
It's almost hard to even imagine a system where it's in it fully.
Yeah.
What are you doing for yourself to make yourself whole?
To make myself whole.
I mean, that's what you started with, right? So I wanna.
Yeah. I think educating myself is one, so learning more about what is fragmentation, what is all of this, but also turning to areas that have been neglected for so long. So, the overwhelming trauma theory is embedded in the global north. And whether it's mental health or trauma or healing, there is so much incredible, expansive things we could learn from the global south, from indigenous practices. And so at the moment I can't go back to Iraq and be in that community, but I have been going to West Africa, to East Africa, to try to immerse and learn from others, other ways of being, other ways of coexisting, other ways of not just existing but flourishing. And I could tell you, it all has to do with meaning making and connection and community, and this I go back to, going where there are not necessarily answers, but that's okay, being in that liminal. So I do that, trying to slow down, really slow down.
Says the person who's going to Africa in a week or so.
Yes. Yeah.
Let me ask you this, because I know you said you immigrated. You went directly to Michigan?
To Michigan.
To the state of Michigan to live, right?
Yeah.
Where in Michigan?
So first we lived in the suburbs of Michigan, and then
suburbs of Detroit.
Detroit.
Yeah.
And then I lived in Detroit.
Okay.
And that was a really powerful experience for me, because in Detroit is when I would take lots of walks. That's when I began to see the similarities of oppressive systems. Because I remember coming to some areas where it was jolting. You would think that you are in a war zone, but this is in the United States of America.
Right.
And I would talk to people on the street, really. I began to see how interconnected everything is. Yeah.
Yeah. So if I have my math correct, you would have been in Detroit or the areas of Detroit when the city went bankrupt, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Obviously not the same as a desert wall, never try to make that comparison, but to the extent that there's sort of collected trauma around a city that had to cut its services and leadership changes and stuff like that. I just wondered, as a young woman growing up at that time, what was it like, kind of being witness to that?
Well, feeling it has to do with knowing you're not in good hands, or again, the idea of feeling abandoned. I mean, I was okay. My family was okay. But I also had people that I met on the corners of the streets. People that I did one of my first rotations was in a psych ward. And people that I got to know there who were not okay, who were affected, and the fragility of how. And it was really hard. I've had a few moments in my life where I pause and I think, oh my goodness, we're so abandoned. We're so on our own. And it's hard. It's really, your nervous system doesn't want to accept it, but it's the reality. And that's how it felt. It felt that way. Yeah.
If you had to, let's take the glass half full,
Yeah.
or maybe they look into the beautiful crystal ball approach here. If you had to describe what a classroom, a campus, an educational experience will look like, that embodies the best of what you think humanity can do and can be, what does that vision look like for you? So people understand trauma, they understand it's more than just not doing harm. It's about going deeper and being radical in that space. I know I'm just not giving you a ton of time.
Yeah.
But I would love to just hear you pontificate, to use your own words, on what that vision looks like for you.
Yeah. Would be a place where it would be a place of non-duality. Would be a place of complexity where we could hold fear and joy at the same time, or sorrow and joy at the same time. Right. And I mean, what makes us human is it's so complex, and part of it is to hold contradictions and be okay, and to go into the unknown and the mystery and the beauty, and also like this trembling, of not knowing. This is what I would. So I had a teacher that described this. He said, when you have a child, and you take the child, you're playing with the child, and you throw them up into the air, and there is this moment of it takes their breath away, and then they fall back, and you have them. In a way, that's the classroom, like this falling back, but the student or you got them.
Right.
We got each other.
Right.
This is what I think of a sanctuary classroom.
But what's beautiful about that, to me at least, is actually not the falling back. It's the point when they're up in the air.
Yeah.
Because that's the discomfort.
Yeah.
That's the willingness to go into the unknown and trust that there's safety on the other end.
Yeah. Yeah.
But in the middle, in between, between the beginning of the journey and the safety, it's potentially even a lot of pain, a lot of darkness, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of but also a lot of discovery.
Yeah,
right?
A lot of discovery. Yeah. Yeah. And I remember, I mean, I had in my undergrad, I did experience some of that. I remember taking a philosophy class, and I was so afraid that the class was very challenging. It was, asked about existence and God and this and that. And I would go every night, I would pray. I put my head on the ground. I would pray and I would say, please God, make me, help me continue believe. I want to be a philosopher, but I want to continue believe. And I would go to class, and I would have this fear that I was going to, it was like a chaos, but it was beautiful. It was beautiful I didn't know what unknown territory, but I felt like, this discovery of the world inside and the world outside, did something for me, and it does something for us. Yeah.
I mean, I almost feel like I do you a disservice by asking you to describe that, because, a lot of times in higher ed, especially in science, we're so obsessed with an answer.
Yes,
right? Like it must look like this. And therefore listener can hear this and go and say, okay, let me replicate that because that is a good thing. Versus what the question is really trying to get at is the journey to undergoing that vision, is the journey to trying to figure out what that looks like for you. And I'll give you an example. As you know, because you've been part of the team that helps run this, we run a national faculty development workshop called the Deep Teaching Residency. And one of the things we ask faculty participants who take this as a deliverable is not just, a plan for what you're going to transform in your class, but they always have a last slide that's an image of what the journey was like for them, right? To look at their course critically, to look at themselves in the mirror and imagine something different and feel the power and bravery to do so. And everyone always comes up with some great designs for what they want to do, practically speaking. But honestly, it's the images that really inspire me because I know how much thought went into those images. I know for many of them, that's the first time they were asked to even think of their class in this philosophical way. And And I make that point to say that I think that exploration journey is in all of us.
Yeah.
Right? And back to the system, it needs to give us a space to really figure out what that is
Yeah.
for each one of us.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that, Brian. I think, how can we empower each other to ask, what's an alternative? What's a more beautiful, sustainable, capacious alternative that bears witness to my students' dignity, but also my own.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about how you experience teaching in this way, being this way. How have your students responded?
I think I had a lot more self-imposed anxiety that came from, I worry what my colleagues are going to say. I worry. The students love it. They want more. I did, for example, semester-long experiment on biofeedback and heart rate variability and so on. And the students, just came up with these interventions that are community-centered, and they honored each other's humanity. They wanted music and art, and yet we were working with complex data and linear regression and this and that. So the students have they want more. They want, as I mentioned to you before, we read the paper recasting the agreements.
Right.
And they often say, by Laura Rendon, and they often say, can we have this agreement? Can we do that? Can we? So I think the students are more than ever, they want to go to those places because how could they not? They come from a system, they are in a system that just beats on them, that tries to reduce them to a number, and then you show them other ways, and they thrive. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. I want to ask you one more question.
All
Get you out
right.
on this one. Because you are so many and too many things, right? You're a teacher, you're a researcher, you're a scholar, you're a keynote speaker, you're a faculty developer. You are a collaborator with other international scholars. And one of the things I've noticed, at least in the last maybe 2 or 3 years about your writings, you have been talking about trauma-informed education in different contexts, right? So you have feedback for people who do faculty development, right? You had a paper, I forgot the name of the journal, but about student success and how to think about it that way. You have papers on how to think about it in your teaching. So you're kind of looking at all of these different, levels in the system and thinking, how can people have this mindset? From the faculty development side, right? This is what we're trying to grow across the world, providing continuous support for instructors in the classroom. What are the things, and again, not the instructors, faculty developers.
Yeah.
What are some of the things you think they should know as they work with faculty on their campuses?
Yeah, that's an important question. It gets to a different point in the system that faculty are trying, faculty are exhausted, faculty are burned out, and faculty are also looking for, I think a lot of faculties are also looking for, there has to be another way. And I think, in a way, faculty developers, we sit in this space where we can be the bridge between administrators and faculty. And instead of just doing the same, active learning, ungrading, assessment, this and that, we have the capacity to begin to reimagine and advocate for empowering the faculty to go into that places of possibilities. What this means, for example, is, for instance, as a faculty developer, I have been thinking about, okay, so I teach and I also work with faculty. I have been thinking about what would a sanctuary look like, right? But I also think, what would a sanctuary look like for faculty, right? And working with faculty. I mean, I mentioned bell hooks. I go back to bell hooks. Bell hooks talks about liberating mutuality for both, for the educator and the instructor and the students. And so for faculty developers, how can we kind of workshop different ways, right? And be the conduit, the bridge to help the administrators see what other possibilities are
possible.
there. Yeah.
Boy. Maze, thanks so much for spending the hour with me, being our last episode.
Thank you, Brian.
You sure?
Yes, of course. Yes.
All right, thanks.
Thank you, and thank you to everyone listening.
Knowledge Unbound is brought to you by the Rios Institute for Racially Just, Inclusive, Open STEM Education. We are generously funded by the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Thank you, as always, to my very, very loyal, very excellent producer, Mr. Segev Amasai, Computer Engineering Major, Class of 2025. Thanks to all of you who've stuck with us. Remember, all of our episodes are available in perpetuity on Spotify, iHeartRadio, on our website at knowledgeunbound.transistor.fm. Don't forget to subscribe so you get to know the latest episodes, even though this one will be the last one for season 1. So we'll see you all next year with another 10 beautiful guests with hopefully more insightful conversations. Thanks to Dr. Imad for closing our series out and just sharing, just having a lovely conversation that I truly hope you've been inspired by. It is both the most beautiful part of education for me, but also the most challenging in trying to communicate and trying to understand what it means to fully be human as you teach a very kind of technical discipline, right? And maybe in the words of Elizabeth Mohay's paper in 1996, that we teach students, not subjects. And maybe starting with that can help us understand better how to privilege the needs of ourselves and the needs of others to make ourselves much more whole when we show up to do good, beautiful work. That's the change we need, and that's the change we're looking for. So until next season, my friends, be excellent to each other.
Work addiction, perfectionism, those are all learned behavior. And we had moments of awakening, like, I can't do this. I don't want to do this. And unlearning is not easy. It takes time, persistence, community. And so just when we started unlearning and saying, no, I really, there has to be another way, then came that push to go back to normal. We've neglected the humanity of the system for so long that having these, 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 workshops is not just going to magically transform it. I think what we could do is start to agitate and plant seeds so the next generation and the following generation can maybe see the fruit.